oftentimes there's problems with these sensory neurons in all of the senses. So that those sensory neurons are not performing their job appropriately when information comes in through the senses. If we have a problem with the sensory neurons processing information through the auditory sense, this can lead to confused auditory signals. And that's often called what we call an auditory processing disorder or an auditory processing dysfunction. Was that organizing or disorganizing? Right? That was rather noxious. Why did Alex play that for us this morning after we've had this beautiful drumming in Mozart? Right? When sensory signals don't get organized into appropriate responses, it's like having a neurological traffic jam. And that prevents certain parts of the brain from receiving the information needed to interpret that sensory information correctly. That's called a sensory processing disorder. So sensory processing disorder looks like that in the brain. It's chaos. Rather than having clear pathways, a clear path to get to where you want to go, the sensory signals get congested. And when they get congested, they can't route to the place that they need to go to have an appropriate interpretation and response to that information. Nothing is wrong with the brain structurally, okay? It's an information processing issue, not a damaged area within the brain. And I think that's important to understand. If somebody has a problem in receiving and interpreting the sensory information correctly, that can be called a sensory processing disorder, and we're going to talk about that throughout the day here. So somebody with a sensory processing disorder will find it hard to process receive and process the information that comes in through the senses. So this creates challenges for them. So we see issues with things like motor skills, right? So the sensory signals lead to confused gross and fine motor functions. We see things like behavioral challenges. We'll see anxiety, not knowing what to expect and what's going to be coming next because the brain doesn't process that information well. That can create anxiety and stress and actually lead to depression in a lot of individuals. We see school failures because it makes it very difficult to perform in school. And for adults, we see career challenges. So adults with sensory processing disorders have a hard time maintaining work relationships and actually keeping employment. They find work to be very hard, just as school is very hard. We see other impacts that happen if this disorder isn't treated effectively. Now, does SPD have a reflection on IQ? No, he has gifted intelligence. So this is a brilliant, brilliant boy. Did he catch it? He didn't catch it. He's had this really through his own life. As a little boy in nursery school, he would be removed from nursery schools. In school, he'd have difficult challenges. What does he look like? He's beautiful, and he has low tone. Okay, so he has low muscle tone. It's what we call kind of a floppy kid. So when you see him, he's kind of like this, and he kind of moves like this, runs like this. So you watch him run, he just isn't really efficient, right? That doesn't look like a good fit athlete when he's running and moving. He doesn't have a great sense of where his body is in space. He has to constantly know what time it is. He doesn't know what time it is. He has anxiety and really has to know what's coming. If things change in the routine, he gets uncomfortable and he gets stressed, right? The routine has to stay very much the same. He learns very rapidly. So as an 11-year-old now, he's in year 5, but he does year 8 and 9 academic work. Right, so very bright, beautiful artist. He's hypersensitive to sound. So when we go to the movies, and actually he's not hypersensitive, he's what we call phonophobic. He doesn't have a sound sensitivity, he has a fear of sounds. So he anticipates that something's going to hurt him. So he covers his ears in anticipation, even though he doesn't test as having hyperacusis. So there's a distinction there. There's a perception that something's going to hurt versus it actually hurting. I can squeeze him. You know, I'm 6'2", 205 pounds. He's a little boy. I can squeeze him as hard as I can, and I can't put enough pressure into his brain to satisfy him. He just loves the deep pressure. I can't hurt him by doing that, but I can touch him lightly, and he jumps, right? So a sense of light touch. When we make foods, he doesn't like spicy foods, and it's been very hard to get him to eat spicy foods. And I cook, and I try to introduce things in the cooking, and he always finds me out. He always knows it's a little bit different. He has this heightened sense, and his sense of smell is extremely acute. He has a low frustration tolerance, so when something isn't working with him, he shuts down very quickly, and it's hard to get him to turn that around. He's controlling, and he's controlling because he's trying to create safety in his environment. So often when we see these behavioral challenges in our kids that we think are these willful behaviors, they're often a reflection of what's happening with sensory processing, because he is controlling his environment to find safety, to find security and predictability so he can be comfortable where he is. So we're not addressing the behaviors, we're addressing how his brain's processing sensory information. And as we improve that, then he'll learn the appropriate behaviors and be able to overcome a lot of these challenges, but it's never going to be that easy for him. So the symptoms that we look for sensory processing disorder are oversensitivity or undersensitivity through the senses, right? Too hot, too cold, too light, too soft, too firm. The odor's too strong or I can't perceive it. The sound's too loud or I don't perceive it. It's too bright, it's too dark. These are some of the contrast examples of that sensory processing. Can't feel deep sensation. Kids come home covered in bruises, have no idea how they got the bruises because they didn't feel it. They walk and walk along walls in the hallway. Do you have any kids that do this? Always kind of have to have this because they don't really know where their body is in space, so this kind of gives them a place to be and to be grounded and connected to, or they're constantly bumping into things. They don't have that sense of body awareness. Difficult for these kids to learn to ride bikes, right? So we see this too. If you think about all the senses that have to integrate in riding a bike until the brain gets to a point of automaticity where it can do that, for a kid with sensory issues, that can be really difficult to do. So life's just harder. Just harder. Things don't come as easy, and it's stressful. And that can lead to problems in self-confidence, right? Self-perception is really affected, so it's a great challenge. We see distractibility, problems focusing and staying on task. We see extremely low energy levels or very high energy levels. So the motor isn't regulated. Sometimes the motor runs fast, other kids' motors run really slow, and that can change within a day. They're totally off and they're totally on. They can have intense reactions to unfamiliar environments or in certain situations. They have social or emotional difficulties, and often group situations are very difficult. It's recognizing what the issues are for what they really are. Why are the behaviors there? They're there because the brain isn't processing sensory input correctly. You can treat the behaviors all day long, but they aren't going to get to the root cause of the problem. We're never going to get to where we need to be unless we address the senses. So there are different types of sensory processing disorder, subtypes. So it's a global umbrella term that encapsulates all forms of the disorder, but there are three primary diagnostic groups, what we call SND, SDD, and SBMD. So it's sensory modulation disorder, which is the SND, obviously, sensory discrimination disorder, sensory-based motor disorder. So let's break these down a little bit and see if we see our child or any of our clients within. So with sensory modulation disorder, the child has trouble modulating their reaction to certain stimuli in one or more sensory areas. So they may over-respond to a situation because it's too intense for them, yet for everyone else it's just fine, or they under-respond. The sensation just doesn't register, so they're kind of unresponsive with certain events. Or they may actually seek stimulation in certain areas. So our son Ethan has this subtype of sensory modulation disorder. Sensory discrimination disorder is difficulty recognizing similarities or differences in sensory messages. In the auditory system, we see this sometimes in phonemic discrimination. Ba, da, right? Ba, da, sh, t. These little differences within the sounds sound the same, they sound similar, and we can't discriminate between the two. So that would be an example of a discrimination disorder in the auditory sense, making it difficult to process language, which has its own host of problems. It can be in one or more sensory systems. You know, for example, a child can hold a coin and not tell heads from tails, right? So by the time a child's 7 or 8, they should be able to hold a coin and know the heads or tails on the coin just by sense of touch. Yet they have no feeling or may not actually hold the coin very well, right? They don't discriminate that sense very well. Sensory-based motor disorder is impaired proprioceptive and vestibular systems, leads to motor problems, including dyspraxia, which is poor motor planning, right? So knowing what step comes after this, so that motor planning is needed to ride a bike, for example, or to climb on playground equipment, right? So to ascend something and descend, say a ladder, takes motor planning in order to do. There can be problems with fine and gross motor skills, posture. Any of your children or kids you work with have posture problems? By the way, this is not good posture. Okay, this is not the picture we want to see. We see this in a lot of these kids, right? We want chest out, shoulders back. We want a good posture. But a lot of these kids are kind of like this. So that's a postural disorder, and that actually resides within the ear. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So you see this poor body awareness with a limp, kind of floppy body as I described earlier. Ethan also has that sensory-based motor disorder, so he actually has a little bit of each of the subtypes.